Greetings, sisters and brothers. Kepra here. Today I want to talk about a movement that began in Africa and found its way into the diaspora. As of late, many of African descent have embraced mostly West African-based spiritual practices referred to as ATRs. Now, this is mainly working with the traditions such as Yoruba-based Isheshe, Lukumi, Santeria, then you have Vodun, Akan systems, just to name a few. However, in this video, I'm going to focus on another traditional line that has spread as the liberation movement for African people as well. There is a verse in the Bible beloved by African-centered preachers on the continent and throughout the diaspora. This is none other than Psalm 68, verse 31, where it says, "And princes shall come forth out of Egypt. Ethiopia shall stretch her hands unto God." Ethiopia. Ethiopianism actually is the movement that began as a religious movement that came out of South Africa circa 1880 CE, Common Era. Ethiopia was seen as the African Zion. This movement pushed for more of an African-centered form of Christianity, but the focus was overcoming the oppression of Black people, both politically and spiritually. One of his focuses was to restore the tribal heritage of those of African descent and liberate the spirits of African people from the mindset of European colonialism. Between 1890 and 1920, this movement flourished and was cultivated in the Black church throughout the diaspora, as well as the continent. Adherents to this way of understanding focus on the idea of an ancient African nation in which culture and principles united and unified all Black peoples of Africa. Given even more conviction of such awareness is due to the fact that on March 1st, 1896, the country known as Ethiopia defeated the Italians in the Battle of Adwa. This was under the reign of King Menelik II. W.E.B. was an adherent to Ethiopianism as well. Du Bois was actually familiar with some of the spiritual traditions rooted in Africa that survived in the diaspora, one of those being Obeah. Now, Obeah is a spiritual practice in the Caribbean that has its root among the Ashanti people of Ghana. There we go. So Obeah is actually an ATR, and it's actually ancestrally based. And we're going to talk about that some other time. But it's very similar, not too different from the Akan tradition, the Yoruba, hoodoo, voodoo, and so forth. Now, we think about the Black church, however. We often have a limited history of the Black church and what it actually was and is. Now, there has been Black nationalists who have argued that Christianity itself is an African religion born on the African continent. But when we do the history, we see that there were actually a couple of places in which Christianity was incubated, one being Alexandria in Egypt and the other being Antioch in Syria. So we see Alexandria 49 AD having been founded by St. Mark, according to tradition. And this is on the African continent. And then we have Asia Minor. Hence, we see what is called the Holy See of Antioch. And this was founded by the Apostle Peter in 34 AD. Now, the origin of Christianity was incubated in Alexandria and Antioch. Okay? However, we'll get the later version of Christianity, in which was created by Rome, and then the Protestant movement breaking off from the Roman Catholic Church. Now you have what is called the Septuagint, which is actually the Bible. It was compiled in the library of Alexandria in Egypt. So you actually have the Library of Alexandria. So it is said that 72 rabbis got together who were ordered by Ptolemy II in circa 1 BCE. So this is how your Bible was created. In the African diaspora, there was also what is called the Garvey movement. Marcus Garvey built a strong Pan-African movement in an attempt to not only build the self-esteem of black people, but also encourage black people, being of African descent, to not only learn about Africa, but recognize Africa as a homeland of black people in the African diaspora. Now let's take a look at the word Ethiopia for a minute, right? Ethiopia is actually a Greek word meaning the land of the burnt-skinned people. Now, it's not the same exactly in meaning as the landmass close off the Horn of Africa today, which contains, what they call Ethiopia now in Eritrea. It's also called Abyssinia and so forth. There's another history around that I'd like to cover later on. However, unlike today's world, the ancient world seemed to have held Ethiopians in high regard. So when they talked about Ethiopians, they were talking about people who were richly melanated, that were in the southern part of, or what they call now sub-Saharan Africa, right? And there's a controversy around that as well. Now, one thing that I like people to understand, though, is that Ethiopia was held in high regard, and we see this in the writings of Diodorus, and Homer, and just to name a few. Diodorus says that the Egyptians actually came from the Ethiopians. The Ethiopians were held in high favor among the gods, right? Then he goes on to say that they were the first of all men created by the gods and were the founders of the Egyptian civilization. This is Diodorus. He also said that the Egyptians are colonists sent out by the Ethiopians, and Osiris having been the leader of that colony. Now, what's also interesting is that it talks about how Egypt was not land, but sea, when at the beginning the universe was being formed. And then it talks about how the land eventually was formed and became Egypt. And that's more to that particular quote. But we're going to talk about that later. Mainly, I want people to focus on how Ethiopia was held in high regard and what led to this movement. Now, when you look at Homer and his works, he refers to, in his writings, the Ethiopians as blameless. So let's talk a little bit more about Marcus Garvey. He says that we Negroes worship the God of Ethiopia. And of course, in this day and age, most of us do not identify with being called Negro. So please don't get caught up on the use of that word. It's a quote, I have to make a disclaimer because a lot of times when we talk about these things, and the minute you mention something, people get caught up on a word that you may have said, and it's like their cognitive faculty just shut down, and they just focus on that instead of getting the message. Anyway, Garvey realized that black people were worshiping the image of their oppressor, and because of this, black people were being held in mental and spiritual bondage. So such an idea created another movement of awareness among black people, and this would be called the Rastafarian movement. And this would also develop around a figure known as Haile Selassie, who was the last emperor of Ethiopia. Rastas refer to him as His Imperial Majesty, and who is by many considered God incarnate. So when we listen to that brother Bob Marley, he says, "There's something you should understand. Great God is a living man." Now he's talking about Haile Selassie being the incarnation of God, but also the fact that God is alive within all of us. You see, so I spent time with some really cool Rasta brothers when they talk about you and me, they say I and I. You see, because they're recognizing not only the unity, right, between two brothers having a conversation, but also the fact that the God that's within me is the same God that's within you. So, by many Rastas, Marcus Garvey himself was considered a prophet, even though Marcus Garvey himself protested against being considered a prophet, right? But this has led to other movements as well, seeking mental, physical, and spiritual liberation from all forms of slavery. And having turned to the concept of an Ethiopian deity, black people throughout the diaspora embraced Ethiopia. Ethiopia, once again, is a Greek word meaning black-skinned people, but it does not necessarily mean it was that particular landmass being referred to that we're familiar with today. Now, I don't want to let you sleep on the fact that, or I will not encourage you to sleep on the fact that that particular landmass does hold significant value, due to the fact that the victory over the Italian colonizer and so forth, because all these various African countries have been invaded and conquered, around the time after the Berlin Conference. So it was Ethiopia that prevailed over those who were coming, trying to come in and conquer Ethiopia. And that's why it was celebrated then and still being celebrated today. Now, for those who are familiar with ancient Kemet or ancient Egypt, the Commission to the 18th dynasty called this land Kush. This region was also known as Upper Nubia. The Commission/Egyptians called the Nubians Akushti. The Kushites were also said to have been of Ethiopian and Nubian descent, depending on how you look at it. Interesting enough, Kushai is a Hebrew word for a black person. So when we look at the Bible, we look at the Table of Nations, it talks about the three sons of Noah in that particular text. And it talks about, the line of Ham, giving birth to Mizraim, which is Egypt, and Cush, which they call Ethiopia, and Punt. Some people have referred to that as being Somalia and so forth. But if you speak to certain people of Ethiopia today, like the Oromo, or even some Somalis I've spoke to, they attach a connection to ancient Cush as far as their ancestry may go back to. So I'm going to wrap this up for now. This is more of an intro, but hopefully we can talk more about this. If you have any comments, feel free to leave in the comment section. Until then, peace and blessings, family.